Hi everybody, very welcome to Mentour, yet another video podcast. This is a special podcast with the reason of the recent Brexit vote in the UK. I have received literally hundreds of questions regarding what kind of impact the Brexit will have on the aviation industry. So I decided to do this podcast, and I hope you're going to enjoy it, and feel free to leave your own thoughts and your own thinking about this in the comment section below. I'm going to start with saying that it's extremely hard to give any accurate predictions about how Brexit is going to affect the aviation industry. And the reason for that is that it's never happened before. Okay, so anyone who tells you that they know exactly what's going to happen because of this are basically lying, because no one really knows. However, we can give a couple of predictions based on data from previous economical shocks and also what we know when it comes to the general economy. One thing that we can start with saying is that the Brexit is not good news for the aviation market. Okay. The aviation market is likely to be one of the industries that are most severely hit, both in the short term and in the long term, by a break from the United Kingdom with the EU. The reason for that is one of the reasons that we started EU in the first place was that we wanted freedom of movement and freedom of people and services within the EU area. Of course, that is also exactly what the airlines want, what the airlines are availing of. We are the ones who are actually moving the people in between the different countries. So whenever there is a barrier being built up inside of an area, it's going to be less easy for airlines to move people in between the countries that are affected. So whenever you have something like this, where you have a withdrawal, instead of more cooperation, you have a withdrawal from cooperation, it's going to affect the airline industry in a negative way. So that is one thing. We can start by going back a little bit to talk about how deals were made and how airlines used to operate before the introduction of the European Union. Now, if you were an airline before the ECAA, which is the European Common Aviation Area, was introduced, say that you were an airline in the UK and you wanted to fly to Germany. In that case, the UK needed to talk to Germany and decide on rules for this to happen. So this UK-based airline want to fly to Berlin. How are we going to do this? In most of the cases, you needed a bilateral deal between each country, and that needed to be made with each and every country that this airline wanted to fly to. You can see how that would start to become complicated. In most of the cases, that meant that a UK airline could only fly from one place, for example London, to Berlin. But in most of the cases, they could not then continue to fly from Berlin and within the German territorial boundary. They could just fly back again to London. So with the formation of the European Common Aviation Area and the EU, what the EU countries basically did was they sat together and they decided on a couple of common rules and said that, okay, all of the ones who are in the ECAA need to abide with all of these rules. And if they do, they will get access to all of the airports within each country, and the airlines will be able to fly from A to B, and then from B out to C, and then back to B again, and basically fly however they want within the ECAA. Now, the ECAA is constructed by both all of the European, like the EU members, and also a couple of members which are not in the EU. An example of that is Switzerland and Norway, right? So Norway and Switzerland, they avail of this single market, even though they're not part of the EU. The problem for example, Switzerland and Norway is that they have no input into the rules that they have to follow to be part of the single market. So most likely, this is the scenario that the UK will now face. Now, they will go from being one of the founding members of the EU to be standing outside and having to basically follow all of the rules for the aviation industry that are being set up in Brussels, but they won't have any input into them. If they want to avail of the single market, they will just have to do what they're told, and that's it. They also have to have something called close economic cooperation with the EU. So this means that they will have to have a lot of economic deals being made on all different areas, not only the aviation area, but basically the same way that we're doing now. So trade needs to still work and so on. So why is this a problem? Well, it's not really a problem, to be perfectly honest. The only thing is that the reason that the UK decided to leave the EU was because they were complaining about the shackles from Brussels. They were complaining about the fact that they needed to follow the rules that Brussels set up and that they couldn't make their own trade deals and so on. Now, if they do want to continue to avail of the single market, they are effectively going to have to do that anyway. But without the chance of actually having input, any say in how the rules are being set. Now you can see how that could be a problem. If the UK would see that as a major problem, it would mean that they would have to break those rules. And the minute they start breaking those rules, they cannot avail of the single market anymore. What this would mean for you guys as passengers is that it's going to be things like visa requirements, severe border controls, things like that, all of the things that happened before the EU was in force. And that is going to obviously have a severe impact on the aviation business because, as I said before, if it becomes harder for people to move in between countries, it's going to reduce the number of passengers flying, which is going to have a negative impact on the economy of the airlines. It is also likely that if this starts to happen, what's going to happen then is that since they cannot be part of the ECAA anymore, they have to start having either a bilateral agreement with the rest of the EU, which is kind of what the United States have with the EU at the moment, which is kind of like the freedom of the single market, however, with some restrictions. So they will be able to set their own rules to a certain extent, but they are also going to have to follow some of the rules statuated, and it's going to be much more complicated. The third thing that will give the UK complete and utter control of their own rules is bilateral agreement with each and every country within the EU. Now that is an enormous task, and it's very unlikely that that's going to happen. But it is a possibility, and it will give the UK the most freedom of setting their own rules and regulations. Right. Good. So in the long term, from my own perspective and also the perspective of IATA, which I'm basing most of these facts on, in the long term it's most likely that the UK will actually stay within the ECAA, much like Norway is doing at the moment. But it also means that then they won't have much input in what the rules are being, what rules are being set for them. Other direct effects that you will see, and you probably have seen already, is of course the depreciation of the pound. The reason that is happening is because the UK is losing power. As part of the EU, the UK was a major player inside of the EU, and as a major player inside of the EU, they were represented 500 million people. Okay, so when they went and did trade deals with other parts of the world, they could say that we have these 500 million people that we are representing, much like a really strong union. We want these deals. Now all of a sudden the UK is saying that now we're actually only representing the people inside of the UK, which is about 60 million, which makes them a much smaller player. Hence, the pound becomes weaker. When the pound becomes weaker, it becomes more expensive for people inside of the UK to travel to other parts of the world and Europe. At the moment, there is a lot more people that's traveling from the UK and out into the EU than there is traveling from the EU and into the UK. Which means that even though it's going to be cheaper for people to come from outside of the UK and in, because the pound is cheaper, it's still going to have, at the moment at least, a bigger impact to the fact that it's going to be more expensive for people inside of the UK to travel out. So that's the depreciation of the pound. When it comes to trade deals, an estimate by IATA, once again, is that trade deals within the next 3 or 4 years or so is going to be adversely affected to the tune of about 10 to 20%. It means 10 to 20% less business, less trade being made with the UK and the rest of the world because of this Brexit. Now that is going to have an impact on, for example, cargo flights. So All in all, this together basically means that what we will probably see is an economic downturn because of this, which will have a negative impact on all of the aviation sectors. It's also likely that UK-based airlines like EasyJet or AIG with British Airways are going to want to secure the positions in the EU by moving some of their operations into EU countries like Dublin, like Frankfurt, something like that. So they might actually, if they really want to avail of all the EU laws and rules and regulations, they might have to split the company into a part that's based in the UK and a part that's based in the EU. That is a possibility, however, we haven't seen that happening yet. But all of this is basically just making life much more complicated for everyone that's involved. So, do I think that this is Armageddon? No, I don't. I think that when all of the dust is settled from this, we're probably, as passengers, not going to see much of a difference, providing that the UK does not start to really deviate from rules and regulations, because if they do, it's a whole different scenario. But if they stay and they keep following EU rules and they keep to the trade deals and everything inside of the ECAA, then you, as a passenger, the only thing that you will actually notice is the depreciation of the pound and possibly some more stringent visa restrictions. But this is all to be left to be seen. Guys, I'm going to post the IATA review of their views on our website. Feel free to come into www.mentor360.com and also, as always, come check out the app. I hope you guys, there's quite a few of you who's downloaded the app now. We're getting great reviews from it. So please, if you haven't, then come into the website or go directly to App Store or Google Play Store. Download it and enjoy it. It's really cool. I do recommend it. For now, keep posting your questions below. I hope that you're all having a fantastic day. And I hope that this podcast has shed a little bit more light on the possibilities of the Brexit. If not, ask me more questions and I'll try to find it out for you. For now, have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time.